Okay, now that we have captured all of those overhead expenses, every time I pay for my utilities on the factory, it goes into factory overhead expense. They accumulate over here in my overhead expense account, all right? Just like any other expense, I debit them and add them all up. Remember our factory labor and our direct materials. I know exactly how much goes out to my jobs. Overhead, all of these expenses that accumulate throughout the year, they need to be applied to the jobs. Regardless of how many jobs I have during the year, those jobs need to absorb their portion of these costs. Now, it's impossible to know exactly how much electricity job number 301 generated. The same with the depreciation. Well, how do you divide that depreciation for the year amongst all the jobs? We have to estimate to our best ability how to get that overhead applied to the jobs. Again, I don't have any specific way to get those details. So I come up with a way to allocate them. Again, remember back to direct materials, I have a piece of paper. I have that materials requisition that tells me exactly how much went to the different jobs. Direct labor, I have more paper. I have time tickets that tell me exactly how much labor was spent on each job. Overhead, I have to allocate. I estimate it. When I look at my production, I try to figure out what is the most common activity that drives the costs of my production. The most common that we use are direct labor hours or direct labor costs. These kind of go hand in hand. Usually the more hours that are generated, the higher the cost is. Or machine hours. Those are the three common that we will look at most in this class. If I have a production facility that is very labor intensive, I'm going to use direct labor. If I have a production facility that is highly automated and I don't have a lot of people putting things together, I will use machine hours. So you're going to find what activity base is specific to your particular production, and that's how you're going to allocate these overhead costs. So at the beginning of the year, you're going to estimate how you're going to allocate your overhead for the rest of the year. All right, so again, we're estimating, or just going to make a big guess, really. So we sit down and we come up with a predetermined overhead rate. And again, this is done at the beginning of the year. You're going to base it off of prior information. And this is a formula that you're going to want to memorize. Right, so make sure you understand what we're doing here. In order to allocate overhead, we have to come up with a rate. So our predetermined overhead rate is made by estimating the total factory overhead costs that we believe we are going to have for the year. How much am I going to pay on all of those overhead costs for the entire year? All of the depreciation, all of the indirect labor, all of the indirect materials, utilities, and everything. I'm going to add it up. And then I'm going to divide it by whatever my activity base is. If I base it on machine hours, I'm going to estimate how many hours I think those machines are going to operate during the year. If I'm going to base it off of direct labor, I'm going to estimate how many direct labor hours do I believe we will have this year. right? So that it's all estimated. So here's an example. Legend Guitars estimates, again, we're assuming January 1st, we're going to sit down and do this, that my total factory overhead costs for the year will be $50,000. My activity base, I'm using direct labor hours, and I'm again going to estimate that for this coming year, I will have 10,000 direct labor hours. So I'm going to divide, here we are, my estimated overhead cost divided by my estimated activity base, direct labor hours, which gives me $5 per direct labor hour. That is the estimate I am going to use to apply overhead on a job-by-job basis. All right, so that tells me how to do it. The predetermined overhead rate is a very high-level estimate. Some companies use something called activity-based costing. Whoops, excuse me. That gets a lot more detailed. We will look at activity-based costing down the road. For now, we're going to stick with this predetermined overhead rate and use it factory-wide. So here we are back to our employees, McInnes and Andrews. They're the hours they worked. McInnes has 6 hours. Oh, we're looking at the total here. Job 71, 350 hours total. All right, out of McInnes only has 6 here. Job 72 has 500 hours. All right, so job 71 from start to where they are right now, 350 hours have gone into this job. Remember, I'm using direct labor hours as my activity base. So those 350 hours, I'm going to multiply it by that predetermined overhead rate because it was $5 per direct labor hour. If I use 350 hours for this job will absorb $1,750 worth of overhead. So here's my job cost sheet that I'm updating. During this month, I've pulled in $2,000 of direct materials. I have $3,500 of direct labor. And based on my direct labor hours, I'm allocating $1,750 of overhead. All right, so there are my 3 product costs, direct materials, direct labor, and overhead, that are now getting added in this month. Right, it had a balance carried forward. There's my overhead. Job 72, same thing for this month. I'm assuming it's for a month. It doesn't really tell us. But during this month, 500 hours were applied between however many employees. Same thing, 500 hours have gone into completing this job. $5 an hour is my allocation rate. So I'm going to allocate $2,500 worth of overhead. Again, it's just an estimate. There's no way to know exactly how much of this is depreciation or utilities or property taxes. Right? We have to come up with some way to estimate it. All right, so there are the 3 product costs: direct materials, direct labor, and overhead, that have been allocated to job 72. All right, here's an example. Using a factory overhead rate of $5 per direct labor hour, $4,250 of factory overhead is applied. Right, there it is. We just looked at this in detail. 350 hours for job 71, 500 hours for job 72, and there are the amounts. So just like the other 2 product costs, direct materials get pulled out of raw materials and moved into work in process. Direct labor, that labor cost also gets put into work in process. Factory overhead is also going to move into work in process. All right, that total amount for overhead for those jobs are added to work in process. All right, so our work in process is increased or debited when we contribute direct materials, direct labor, and allocate overhead. So there's your journal entry. And here's my little T account for manufacturing overhead. As factory overhead is increased, we're going to debit overhead. All right, just like in any other expense account, it gets debited as the expenses are incurred. All right, so if I actually pay a $20,000 rent payment on the factory building, instead of going to rent expense, it goes to manufacturing overhead. When we calculate the estimated overhead based on that predetermined overhead rate, when I estimate it and allocate it to the jobs, I'm going to credit it. All right, so I will take these expenses, allocate them to a job, credit my manufacturing overhead, and remember it gets debited to work in process. All right, actual and applied will differ. All right, these are the actual expenses. The application or the allocation is going to be different, again, because we estimate it. There will never be a perfect allocation of our overhead costs. I hope that makes sense. All right. Because we can't perfectly estimate this, again, there's always going to be something left in here. We might overestimate or underestimate. In a perfect world, I would know exactly how much to allocate, and my manufacturing overhead would be perfectly allocated, and as the actual expenses came in, they'd go exactly to the jobs perfectly, and this manufacturing overhead account would wash out. There would be nothing left. But again, we're estimating, we're kind of guessing, and it's not perfect. So the next video, we're going to talk about that overhead and what to do with the leftovers, if you will.